going to say in this whole Nikon Z thing. Because so much of the coverage I see of it, I think, is completely dumb. And the point behind it is completely dumb. A side-by-side specification comparison between the Nikon and the Sony is completely missing the point of what this camera is for and what it can do. Same with the Canon thing that's going on too. Here's what I think is being missed. If you are an avid photographer, you have seen the religious discussions about Nikon versus Sony and Canon versus Sony, and the switch to Sony. Up until this point, the discussion has not been between DSLR and mirrorless. There has not been a cam. There's not been a platform for a cam discussion about should I shoot mirrorless or should I shoot DSLR. It has been a heated religious discussion between brands because Nikon and Canon have not had a viable option. So that's what this changes, and taking that out wider, that is a huge change. And I've been, like, a year ago I posted, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, the Nikon DF2 is here, but it's made by Fuji, and I talked about this stuff a year ago and what I pleaded with Nikon to create, so that I wasn't choosing between Nikon and another brand, I was choosing between DSLR and mirrorless, and that's what we have here, and it's not being talked about enough. Here's the deal for me. This camera doesn't have to be better than the Sony. I don't know if it's better than the Sony. I don't care if it's better than the Sony. This camera has to be good enough. That's the bar that this camera has to reach. It has to be good enough for Nikon people like me to go, I'm so happy with this camera. And the adapter, there's almost more pressure on the adapter for me than the camera itself. The adapter has to be wicked awesome. The adapter has to be able to take the lenses that I prefer and are in my stock, and they're not even crazy great lenses. They're like the Tokina 100mm f2.8, the Nikon 85mm f1.8, the Nikon 50mm 1.8. What else? That's kind of it for me. I mean, my other lenses, I have a couple of lenses, like, I'll be sad. No, it'll work manual focus for micro. So the 60mm Nikon D micro, not the G, will not autofocus with this camera and adapter, but for macro work, I'm fine with that. But all my old lovely glass that I really love to use, and you know what? You know where I've used it? On Fuji's and Sony's. My vintage f2.8 zooms, my vintage 55mm macro lens, all of these lenses that I have brought back to life for Fuji's and Sony's are now just sitting there pretty for this Nikon with the adapter. So that's half of the argument. Half of the argument is for Nikon people, and looks like for Canon people too, but I haven't really looked at that camera in detail. If I was buying a new camera right now, 6 months ago, no brainer. If I was buying a new camera, well, it was hard. It was between the D5 for that kind of stuff that I do, or the D850 for studio work, which is more what I do. So the D850 probably would have won. 3 to 6 months ago, when this was all just a rumor, no brainer choice. If I was buying a new camera, I probably would have ended up with a D50. Right now, if I was buying a new Nikon camera, I'd have to wait and get my hands on this to see if it blew my mind. I'm a Nikon guy. I get to choose, do I want a Nikon DSLR or do I want a Nikon mirrorless? And that cannot be underestimated. Now, if you take the Sony fanboys out of the picture and you take people who have moved to mirrorless because mirrorless gives them, like, the instant depth of field preview, lighting preview, like all of the benefits of mirrorless. If you take the Sony people who are on the Sony bandwagon because of that, now Sony pricing is really aggressive and it's really good. If somebody has Sony and a bunch of Sony lenses or Rokinon lenses that are Sony mount, like, they're not going to jump ship to this. But what about the Nikon people who still have Nikon glass and even use Nikon glass on Sonys? Where are they going to be? I'm really interested to hear from that group of people. They now have choices of different brands, and again, it goes back to, it's not, do I want a DSLR or do I want mirrorless? That whole thing is blown apart. But let's look at something else interesting. Here's what happens if you look for best beginner camera. So if I'm having a discussion with a friend and they say, what camera should I buy as a beginner? I find that super hard. I've made videos on it. Most of the time, it's your flipping phone. Your flipping phone is the best camera for you. Unless you want to get into, like, I say to people, if you don't want to get into proper editing, don't buy a DSLR. If you don't want to get really serious, and I've got a video on this, if you're just going to buy something at Costco, like something like this, and never change the lens, just don't waste your time and money, and it's just annoying. If you want to get into photography, then really get into photography. The kit lens is not your friend, but that's a whole different discussion. But look what happens when you look at best beginner camera. How many Sonys do you see? There is still a perception that a real camera looks like this. If you want to get into photography, this is where you got to go. Now, the best beginner cameras for 2018, and it's synonymous with DSLR. So, what's the best budget camera for beginners? Let's see what B&H say. The DSLR, mirrorless cameras. So great. There is some information in mirrorless cameras. Point and shoots. Great. There is some of that. But you are smacked in the face with DSLR if you want a good camera. If you want a, I'm air quoting, good camera. Let's see, entry level camera, I think comes up with, right. So if you want to take things seriously, even that looks more real than that. These entry levels, people do not think, they think of these as toys, even though they're super capable. Very similar in many ways to this, but this kind of chunky DSLR look is what people take seriously. So, best digital camera for beginners, 7 recommend. So again, I searched for entry level camera. What I'm getting back is 90% DSLR. So what does that mean? What that means is, to this day, people who go from picking up their phone and having a thing for photography, moving from there to wanting to go to the next level, they're still buying Nikons and Canons. Those people, 6 months ago, as they got to a point of taking that very seriously, and we're talking about very seriously, I think Sony are still going to clear up, and Fuji are still going to clear up within the, hey, I want to spend a little bit more money. I want to spend maybe $1,000 or $1,500 to get to the next level. Sony and Fuji are still playing really strongly in that space. But somebody who goes from the entry-level DSLR, maybe buys, like, say the Nikon. Say somebody buys a Nikon 5 series, then buys a Nikon 50 f1.8 for portraiture, maybe buys a 100 millimeter or 135 or an F, that Nikon constant f4 zoom. When they get to the point now, 6 months ago when they got to the point, I want to take this to a whole new level, it was a Nikon versus Sony discussion, and now it's not. And I don't think that is being emphasized enough. I think that is what is going to make these cameras a huge success for Nikon. And again, as long as you can slap that adapter on, and use old lenses. I mean, look at the revival. Look at the revival of prices of vintage Nikon glass because of Sony and Fuji. Look at the number of people with mirrorless cameras that are not Nikon that are using vintage Nikon lenses. I mean, that in itself just shows that the Nikon brand as a mirrorless platform could be pretty astonishing. And I can't be the only Nikon person. I can't be the only Nikon person who has held on to Nikon because they love Nikons and because they pick up a different camera and it just feels odd. It might have better ergonomics, it might have better layouts, it might have better button position, but I mean, look at that. I could pick this camera up and from what I've seen, switch to it in the same way as, with the same level of efficiency as I go from like my Nikon full body like D3S to a Nikon D850. So I can go between those two in the same way as I could go to this. And that's huge. So that is my rambling 12-minute discussion of the Nikon Z series. And I think that's all I've got to say about it. That, and let me just take a final minute to say, anybody who's created a spec side by side of these to the Sonys, don't waste our time. That's just dumb. That's just so irrelevant to the big picture of what is going on here. I just think it's dumb. So have a nice day anyway. Cheers.